it's Kevin with the Rogue Deck Builder here with my reaction to the banned and restricted announcement for June 30th. This is only going to be affecting Standard. And a few weeks ago, I did a list of my own of 5 cards that I wanted banned out of Standard. And this list is actually very similar. In fact, 3 of the 5 that I picked for that list were banned. And a couple of the other pieces to cards that I wanted banned out of Standard, they were also picked in this list. So I'm actually quite happy with this ban list. I think it is going to shake up the format. Now I'm looking over, I would have picked one more card to be banned off this list, and there also is a little bit of problems with their theory behind banning these cards. I think there is some financial motivation, as 2-card combos are dominating the format right now, or just 2-card synergies. And instead of picking the expensive version, it seemed like they decided to go after the uncommon or the cheaper version of the bans and not hit the expensive cards. And I think that 2 of those cards, which they should have banned, are going to continue to be problems in the format going forward, and are still going to define the meta. So before I get into that, I was going to do a video reacting to the analysis of other content creators and pros with the cards they wanted banned. I think a lot of people are missing a huge hole in the reasoning for how kind of metas evolve and what actually becomes problems. So if you're actually looking at the Pro Tour, it was dominated by Izzet, and it was also dominated by Mono Red, which the top 8 was just Izzet and Mono Red decks. They were all basically Monstrous Rage, kind of prowess type decks. And there was one big factor to why I think that people chose those decks, and it is called mid-range and control are unplayable right now in this format. So we'll go over the list here in a second, so just bear with me. Monstrous Rage was a huge problematic card that made decks that traditionally do well against red or aggro actually not. It shifted that to basically a 50-50 matchup, or even slightly better for like the red and Izzet matchups, because of how good Monstrous Rage was at pushing through damage. So traditionally, things like mid-range or go wide Celestia strategies can come in to kind of farm the Mono Red when Mono Red is... In fact, if you actually look at when Mono Red wins tournaments, it usually is like a tier 2 deck, and it just sneaks in because no one's prepared for it. So this is like one of the first Pro Tours where Mono Red, I mean, we've had other ones too. I guess when back in Amoket, there was a situation where Mono Red was the #1 deck, ended up winning, I believe, and it was a surprise to no one. But this, we've had other Mono Reds do well in the past when they kind of slide in there, and when Mono Red is actually the best deck, or is it in this instance, typically it gets like crushed by like a pro team that figures out a way, because that's kind of what we call the metagame. You either play the best deck, you play the deck that beats the best deck, or you play the deck that beats the deck that beats the best deck, thinking that people are going to play the deck that beats the best deck, so that's why it's called the metagame. And unfortunately, with this one though, everyone just slammed Izzet, and Izzet did quite well, and Mono Red did quite well, and it just defined the entire Pro Tour. But there's one like major problem that I had with this format, and it's called Omniscience and Up the Beanstalk, because those were the 2 cards that were making all the mid-range strategies and control strategies completely unplayable to be able to beat out Izzet and Mono Red. And I actually think that Mono Red and Izzet are something that you can build decks. I've been very successful in building decks specifically to beat up those decks. You do have to dedicate a ton of removal though to combating those, and then it just allows for the Up the Beanstalk or an Omniscience deck to slide in, and just, those matchups become completely unwinnable so you can't go into a tournament or into even like an F&M with like a deck that is specifically there to beat Izzet or Mono Red when you have the looming problem that is Omniscience and Up the Beanstalk. So I'm glad they've kind of addressed that, but I think that a lot of the analysis from people that have been theorizing about what cards need to be banned, they're missing that huge problem. It's often in a standard that is warped, that is actually not the #1 or #2 deck. It's usually those tier 3 decks that are the real problem, because the threat of them being like, if you go back when I was super salty about Modern, it was things like the Crackland Ironworks decks, or the I'm trying to think of the other infinite combo based strategies that never hit tier 1 status, but were just always there to make all these other decks, like I said, kind of the mid-range or the synergy value decks, completely unplayable. So anyway, with that out of the way, I'm going to give my analysis of each of these cards, and then we'll read Wizards' analysis, and we'll go from there. And I'm going to make an announcement right here. I think that since I've been so inconsistent of doing Market Mondays on this video, we're going to move them over, or on this channel, we're going to move them over to the Rogue Market. So after this video, I'm going to be recording a Market Monday with the financial aspects of these bannings, and I think I'm going to pick some winners and losers of cards you should get out of and cards that might be actually financially viable now to spec in before this ban really takes effect. So we're going to see the meta actually start to hopefully not warp again, but start to evolve with these bannings, and it'll be interesting to see the financial implications of that as well. So anyway, let's get on to Cori-Steel Cutter. Of course, this is the number one card that need to be banned. This card is just too powerful for standard. It is another let's put trample on a red card, which is just at this point so asinine. I think the Wizard of the Coast has missed the plot of what red does. So unfortunately, like, green decks have been pushed out, especially green stompy decks, because red just does everything better. The creatures are on par as aggressive. Like, we're seeing, it used to be only green that would have like an extra power or toughness, and now we're seeing like cards like against Screaming Nemesis just be a 3/3 for 3, when traditionally like there'd have to be some sort of drawback if they're going to get an additional 1-for-1 power and toughness. We've even seen them push even further with green, but a lot of times you need to have the haste or the ETB effects to make a card actually viable. And so they've been just pushing trample compared with haste on red instead of something like Golgari. And I think it's been a problem in design for that's it. There's been always the meme that we want to unban. Let's not ban cards. Let's unban blocking in Magic the Gathering, because blocking is so miserable now with trample, and especially now with like when you pair haste and trample and prowess, then it gets incredibly frustrating to have any cards that used to be meant for blocking. We used to see like, what's the 0/4 draw card wall that was, I think it was in Final Fantasy, but not in Standard. That used to be like a mainstay. Like people, or you go back to the sheep, the 0/5 sheep for 2 mana that gained a life per turn. Those used to be like the answers to red, and those cards are so laughable now because they just don't really do anything. They just sit there and they can't even block with them because the damage gets pushed through. So Cori-Steel Cutter, I think, was just a problematic card with the trample especially. And I mean, this card just does everything. It goes wide, it goes tall, it makes blocking miserable. It makes playing with interaction, because oftentimes you can kill the Cori-Steel Cutter, but it left back a token, already got some value out of it. And paired with blue, where you can dig for more of them, this card, again, does everything. It's aggressive. It can kill you on turn 4 if you get like a 1-drop in the Cori-Steel Cutter and then chain off with spells, especially paired with like a punt spell like Monstrous Rage. It can play the grindy route by just spitting out tokens that have to be dealt with. This card was just absolutely miserable. It was too good for standard, and I don't think anyone's sorry for this to go. There were some interesting equipment strategies with Cloud that were starting to be built, and this was one of the better equipments, even though those decks really didn't get the value of creating the Monk token. The +1/+1 trample and haste for 2 mana was just super, super strong for an equipment. And this card just did everything. So I don't think anyone is really sad this one goes. It was too good for standard. It sees play in Modern, it sees play in Legacy, it sees play in Pioneer, and I believe it even sees play in Vintage. That's how strong this card is. So I don't think that anyone is sad for this to go. It was way too powerful for standard. The next one's Abuelo's Awakening. Now this one is like a miss, in my opinion, because the real problematic card is Omniscience, and Omniscience stays around forever, indefinitely, when they just decide that they're done with Foundations. So we don't know. They've given a timeline. They want it to be at least 5 years, and then we've heard them flirt with 7 years. And so Omniscience being printed in an evergreen set was, like, we've seen Omniscience warp formats in the past. I don't know why they decided that they were going to put this as a 7-year card, and it is only going to be a matter of time before Omniscience warps the format again. The deck just wins as soon as it's slammed. It's very, very impossible to interact with. It's very unfun. I think the joy of playing Omniscience is outweighed by the misery of everyone else that has to play against Omniscience. And banning Abuelo's Awakening is not going to get rid of Omniscience decks. You can already still turn 4 Omniscience. You have to be a little more creative on doing so, but you can zombify the Final Fantasy one that brings back an enchantment, for example. That's a turn 4. I know it's a little bit rough you're into like Abzan at that point, or actually 4-color Sultai, Abzan, whatever you call the 4-color pairing. And your deck gets a little more inconsistent in that way, but it's still possible to turn 4 an Omniscience in Standard. And now turn 5 is very viable. There are plenty of other ways that you can reanimate an Omniscience in Standard on turn 5 very consistently without really having to add anything more to the deck. So Abuelo's Awakening instead of Omniscience is very weird, because this card isn't the problem. This isn't the one that is like where it's creating a scenario where the game is, I guess they're like, oh, you can get artifacts back with this too, and that could be a problem in the future because people could just now reanimate we got the Phyrexian one that's rotating that was a good reanimation target, but it's kind of besides the point. I think that this wasn't necessarily, maybe they're like, okay, a 4-drop reanimator is too strong, But I mean, reanimator type strategies you need to have, I believe, 4. I think 5 is just too backbreaking for those strategies to work. And I'd just rather just like take out Omniscience. That's the problem. There's going to be some sort of card that, you know, casts a free spell in the future, or another reanimation-based strategy that gets... the thing is, Omniscience only needs to be around for like 1 turn. So a lot of the cards that just cheated in has to be sacrificed, or, you know, cheated in for a split second, and then you can cast off a bunch of instances. Those type of cards are, I mean, they're going to be printed. We know that Wizards are going to flirt with these type of things. And Omniscience, mark my words, is going to be broken again. Just as I stated when I saw it spoiled in Foundations, it's going to be a problem card. And just banning one of the kind of the symptoms, the enablers, is not going to make Omniscience obsolete. All right, so on to Monstrous Rage. Yeah, this card was just absolutely miserable. Again, it was the trample that really pushed this over the top because it made blocking impossible, and the monster roll that stuck around. So it's a permanent trample. We've all had a million analysis of this card. It is just too powerful for Standard. It's another card that does see play in like Modern and Pioneer. I think that's kind of a good litmus test if it's like dominating those formats and like pushing out all these other cards. I mean, that's the whole reason they created Modern Horizons, was they didn't have to print like modern powerful cards in Standard, and that whole theory has, you know, gone out the window at this point. But this card was just too good. And there are a billion other replacements for this that are just slightly worse. And the thing, slightly worse is actually mountains in this particular format or in Standard. So I don't think red players should be crying too much, because they have, like I said, a billion other cards that can just slot in for Monstrous Rage that are more creative. Like, the problem is that like all roads led to to playing Monstrous Rage because it just did everything. Now they have to kind of choose. Would they like to have a detective if the card gets dealt with? Would they like to have +3/+0 in haste? Like, there's a lot of other options right now instead of Monstrous Rage that basically do the same thing. But speaking of which, one of the problems, though, is Monstrous Rage just lost, or the Prowess Heroic type strategy just lost kind of its best 1-drop, was Heartfire Hero. So again, this is another one that just paired so well with the other mouse, the Double Strike mouse, the Manifold. And they chose this one, I think, again, because of Uncommon. That was the big... Like, a lot of people were calling for the Offspring Manifold, the one that gives Double Strike and Trample to a... And they needed to get... That 1-2 punch was just so strong. Because you'd have a 2/2 Double Striker on turn 2 and then what do? You kill one of them and you still have the value out of it. Heartfire, though, actually, now that I think about it, Heartfire probably is the right ban, because if they didn't ban Heartfire Hero, and now they've kind of banned Monstrous Rage, I'm thinking that the mono red decks are just going to go back to the Rakdos version, the version that's really being run right now in Pioneer, which is more of the fling version, and you'd still have like Heartfire Hero and the Cacophony Scamp, and that deck would now just be the new mono red. And the deck was just slightly worse. Like, people like the consistency of this one over than the kind of glass cannon all-in strategy of the Heartfire and the Cacophony, and then, you know, pumping up at the million different pump cells and then sacrificing it. I mean, they're losing 2 now pieces, so I think that Wizards of the Coast is kind of guaranteeing that red decks just don't morph back over that. So I think they want red decks to be more traditional of how like a red deck win strategy, where it's where both creatures and burn spells, maybe actually Lightning Strike will be viable again in the format, instead of people just going all in on this like prowessy heroic low to the ground. And so getting rid of the 1-drop, I think, is actually the right one to go by, even though I think this is more financially motivated with hitting an uncommon. It doesn't feel as bad as hitting a rare. I think that's why they chose that, which is kind of pathetic in my opinion. On to the next one is Up the Beanstalk. This is absolutely just... This card was a problem, and it's going to continue to be a problem. The wording was the issue with this. So I am a huge believer in banning bad design cards. This card is not working as intended. So when they created this card, I know it is supposed to be, if they were to reword it, when you cast a spell spending 5 or more, draw a card. Then Up the Beanstalk is a lot better. But the problem is when you cast a spell with mana value of 5 or greater, and you have ways to cheat in that, where you have a Golgari list that can reduce cards. This could even be thrown like an Affinity Shell in the future. We had some Affinity cards that were printed in. We've seen it actually see play in like the ones that are reduced by amount of spells. I mean, even there's some Affinity for like enchantments. Like, there's so many ways to break up the Beanstalk. But the main thing is they keep printing these like reducers, so the spell costs 4 less to cast if it's targeting a tapped creature, or they have all these things that make reductions, and all of a sudden this like draft common that had very little implication becomes like a standard powerhouse when paired up with the Beanstalk, because it has basically a draw card attached to it. So again, it was the wording of this that was printed, in my opinion, incorrectly. Unfortunately, I wish they could errata it and go back, because this would still be a fun little card and it would work as intended, because it wants to start giving you value once you actually start casting your 5 or greater spells, not your play this on turn number 2 and slam 2 cards in 1 turn and draw 2 more cards. Yeah, so this card is an absolute problem. I've heard some analysis saying, oh, once domain rotates with the enchantment that gets reduced, this won't be a big problem. Yes, it will. The Overlords still exist. As I mentioned, there was even another one out of Final Fantasy that was printed that is you target an attacking creature, a tap creature, it costs like 3 less or whatever, and that ends up being like a really good synergy again with Up the Beanstalk. This card was a problem. It made mid-range decks that didn't play Up the Beanstalk completely unplayable, and yeah, I think what also they realized that if you ban like the decks that did beat the Overlords right now were the Mono Reds and Izzets. So now getting rid of those or significantly nerfing those decks is probably going to make like Zur the Enchanter, or now with Uni with the Overlord strategy, basically be the new boogeyman of the format. And that deck, particularly, as I mentioned before with Omniscience, I think pushes out a lot of strategies that could be viable. Like any sort of combo synergy-based strategy just gets absolutely like eaten up by Up the Beanstalk, because the value that's generated, the amount of interaction it takes for just slamming down Overlords with Up the Beanstalk is just insane. Alrighty, so now we got into a weird one, because I see the thought process here is, okay, well, if we hit these 2 decks, well, then what about Dimir Bounce and Esper Bounce and Orzhov Bounce? Is it just going to be, we're basically going to be this nightmare of a format with Hopeless Nightmare? And I don't know. I think that this card is actually a lot more fair, and actually is very interesting, because it gives the bounce decks, I mean, this is a lot better. We still have Tiny Bow and Jones up, but the 2 life does matter. I actually don't think the strategy is dead, though. I mean, maybe Tiny Bow joins up doesn't do the 2 damage every time. So, yeah, that's actually and you can have multiple copies out. But there are also some other cards that can be replaced in this slot where Bounce can still, go a different strategy with it. So I'm not quite sure about this Hopeless Nightmare, like was this card actually as problematic as it was? And a lot of reasons that people were playing this deck, myself included, is because of the matchup was really good against Mono Red. So this was like a metagame call that you could still have like this play against other creature-based decks. And so this deck also, the Orzhov deck, it preyed on a lot of the decks that did prey on Mono Red. And so again, it was a meta call. And I don't know if the statistics were really there to justify a banning of Hopeless Nightmare. Otherwise, they want to just nip this in the bud before, all roads led to, okay, we're going to go over to Orzhov Bounce. And apparently this deck is super unfun to play against, but there are so many answers right now in the format to Hopeless Nightmare. Like you have the Wilt Leaf Liege and you have Obstinate Baloth that are just backbreaking. Like if this card got good, you had the natural counter of those 2 cards where it's like, okay, well, first turn you Hopeless Nightmare. Okay, I get a 4/4 into play and gain 4 life. Good luck with that. So, yeah, I think it was naturally kept in check. And this deck just has some really bad matchups to begin with. And so the meta could have adjusted to combat this strategy, in my opinion, just fine. But I'm okay with it. I'm okay with this card going. It was a very unfun card for many. Like the bounce has really played itself out. I guess, unfortunately, this is the only way that they can force a quote-unquote rotation is by banning cards at this point. And they know that this deck has been played out. They've seen enough coverage with the Orzhov Bounce deck that people are probably, sick of it. And Standard is a rotating format. It's not Pioneer or Modern where they want decks to stick around for a while. And so I can definitely justify and get behind this banning. This one's the weird one. This town ain't big enough. So this should have been the Otter. So the enchantment that puts out the Prowess Otter, because that was the combo. And I know that this also did have some synergy with Up the Beanstalk, but Up the Beanstalk got banned, so this town ain't big enough is definitely not as good now with Up the Beanstalk out. And so the combo was just basically, it created like this value engine with, why can't I think the Otter card? We'll look at it in a second. And I know that they're thinking, okay, if we get rid of Cori-Steel Cutter, maybe the Izzet decks will go back to being more of a mid-range and really try to utilize this town ain't big enough, because it can bounce a few cards that get a lot of value. But in my opinion, it was a fun card. This card is enabling, and it was on its way out in a lot of different I know that they were starting to show up a lot more in even omniscience decks were running these because I've seen them because you could then bounce something later on and then, cast things, and then omniscience has like a 0 chance of missing at that point. And this did see a ton of play. But I'm not quite certain if this was the banning or it should have been, in my opinion, it still should have been the Otter, because I think that's going to be the next problematic card is going to be the Otter. So let's just go over now. Let's look at the metagame as it stands, and I'm going to give my predictions of where it's going to go. So first of all, the other card that I think that they, like, this Hopeless Nightmare was just a huge signal of where their thought process was going. Okay, we need to, if we ban these cards and this is going to be the problematic card, okay, well, I think at that point you need to hit Dimir and you need to hit like black. So I think that this is where we're going to be headed again, is back to demons. So Unholy Annex and Ritual Chamber is probably a card, I'm calling it right now, it's going to be a card that eventually is going to be banned out of standard because the value that this card generates and kind of the like miserable options. So this card just does too much. It's actually a 6/6 for 5 mana is not bad at all in certain scenarios. And then the ability for this to gain 2 life. And we even got a new 2-drop demon. In this list doesn't look like it's playing it, but didn't we get a 2-drop demon out of Final Fantasy that's 2 mana? Correct me if I'm wrong. Demonic Wall or something that actually now synergizes quite well with Unholy Annex, and it's just gonna be a problem going forward, in my opinion. This is a card that did dominate a few Pro Tours and a few other metas earlier before Cori-Steel Cutter, and I think this is going to be the default deck. We're going to see a lot higher win percentage for Mono Black. One of its worst matchups was Mono Mono Red was actually tough for it. That's what's so funny is they're running so much of duresses, cut downs. Look at how this go over the throat, Shoulder's Edict, trying to Dreams of Steel and Oil to get out the Cori-Steel Cutter, the cut down's dress, and it still had a bad matchup versus Is It in Mono Red. And so this deck can actually start, I think they can go way down in the amount of removal spells, and they can actually start to pack like a bigger punch. And there's a few different ways to build this. You can actually go the turn 4 combo with the Unholy Stopper and the demon out of Ixalan that kills on, if it's unblocked, it kills on turn 4, and that happens often. You can see like Liliana is going back in the main because you'll be able to dedicate less now for removal because of the mono red threat is not going to be as big. But actually, I'm thinking mono red still is very, very playable. It just has to now go back over to more of a spell slinger type where they're adding burst lightnings and probably lightning strikes in this list. Maybe you can go over to Boros with the lightning helix type thing. There's still a few cards in Boros that I think are quite interesting to add in the mix. Like Boros tokens also gets interesting again. It could be your go-to either the Jeskai or the Boros tokens list. I think is still quite strong. The thing is that's going to be rotating. That'll be a deck that will not survive rotation. But yeah, mono red, in fact, is going to still be part of the meta. You have plenty of options now besides having the Heartfire Hero. Like this version right here, look at this could just slap in the other prowess, the 1/2, and it's fine. It's still, Monstrous Rage has a million different targets for pumping up spells. You still have the Screaming Nemesis. Again, this is another card too that I think is eventually going to need to be probably banned. It just does too much. It's another card that makes blocking miserable, makes life gain obsolete. And I thought that they were like printing this like, okay, what if like life gain becomes such a problem? And Screaming Nemesis is just the obvious answer to that. But it was just a very aggressive card to begin with. It's exactly the curve topper that red wants. So yeah, this is going to be a very weird card, in my opinion, to stick around in standard, not be a problem in the future. So yeah, mono red I don't think is going anywhere. I think it's fine. I think the Is It decks definitely do morph over into more of a Vivi. Like Draycatcher, I don't know if it's going to be the right way to go. Vivi still has some, you still have the Agatha's Cauldron Vivi that doesn't really get affected too much with, like, it did utilize Cori-Steel Cutter, and often many of the decks did use Monstrous Rage, but the whole thing was just a value engine with stock up. There's another card that's been talked about like crazy because it's the most played card, and it does seem to be too efficient. It seems like a dig through time type card, and there's no investment. It's a very easy dig through time. Now, dig through time is 2 mana. I know it was instant speed, but basically looking at the top 5 cards, you're going to find your answer. And this paired up with like Vivi, I mean, again, they're not going to go Drake-Hatcher. They could go the other otter that like digs for non-creature spells. But anyway, yeah, speaking of which, it's Storm Chaser Talent. So there still is quite a bit of problematic cards, in my opinion, that are going to need to be dealt with in Standard. Storm Chaser Talent and Vivi are definitely on the list and stock up. So by all means, this deck is not dead. It still has the most powerful cards in Standard in the form of stock up, Storm Chaser Talents, and Vivi. You could actually see this morphing over into a Jund list. I think there's a cool little Jund Crimes list with Vivi because it's quite easy. Oh nope, it doesn't actually trigger crimes. I thought it would. It deals damage to each opponent, so it doesn't actually target. But this could actually make a Grixis list viable again with Vivi at the helm to then utilize some cheap removal spells. Storm Chaser Challenge still in there, stock up still in there, and it just being a value engine that it just grinds out. So people have talked about this card for sure, being the real winner out of the Pro Tour because it put in so much work. And a lot of the Izzet decks that did do well were running this list of the heavy on the VVs rather than going on more the low to the ground with Monastery Swiss Spears. So, yep, there definitely is some problems there. So these decks I actually think are still going to stick around. So we're still going to see the mono black midrange. We're still going to see mono red. We're still going to see Izzet be very viable. The 4-color Zur I actually think is still okay without the Up the Beanstalk. They're going to have to find another value engine. I mean, this list is still very, very viable. We have Zur that's rotating, but you have Yuna that is actually still a powerhouse because Yuna, I believe it can get... Yeah, so Yuna can actually ramp out an Omniscience. I wonder if people are going to try that with maybe sort of like an Atraxa-based strategy and a Yuna-based strategy because they don't try to... Yeah, I don't think they try to reanimate Yuna in this shell, but I've seen some reanimator strategies too that try to actually get Yuna out and then you get another card out from Yuna and it just goes nuts at this point. So I think a lot of reanimator shells are going to be viable. We have Zombify that's still in the format. So as I stated, you can still get Omniscience by zombifying a Yuna. And not sure if that's the right route that people want to go, but Omniscience works fine with, you can cast any spell with Omniscience. It doesn't have to be a non-creature, so you can go pretty crazy with creature-based decks with cheating out an Omniscience. So this deck will definitely have to adjust how it builds things. It's going to be wanting to run removal spells that don't utilize Up the Beanstalk as much, but by all means, it's not dead. And that's why this ban list is very interesting because I don't think it absolutely kills any deck completely. I mean, you can make the argument for Omniscience, but it sets it back a turn. There are other ways to reanimate it. And there will be just a matter of time before it does see some sort of card that breaks it again. And again, that's the problem is they have to be very careful now with creating cards that just pair with Omniscience. For 7 years, they have to do that. Why would you want to kneecap yourself with, put that restriction in with deck design or card design? The Omniscience is always this looming threat that, does this pair with Omniscience? Okay, then we can print it. Yeah, it seems silly. They should have just, again, nipped that in the bud rather than going with Abuelo's Awakening. Alrighty, so other ones, though, we'll have to look at cards of yesteryear, decks of yesteryear. Of course, the Golgari and Insidious Roots, this deck is just taking off by storm. Not necessarily this particular version. There are a lot of, this is Jund Roots, so I think a lot of people are back over their Golgari, but Haywire Might has just been such a powerhouse right now in the meta. And you pair that with Insidious Roots, and you just have this value engine. This deck was starting to get more popular because it had an insane matchup against Izzet. So with Izzet getting nerfed a little bit and actually morphing into more of a Vivi, I'm not sure it will be as good against that version as it was against the kind of lower the ground one. But why people like this deck is it just has answers to everything. It applies a lot of pressure. It's got a lot of card advantage. It does suffer from things like Rest in Peace and the other ways to interact with the graveyard, but you have the Haywire Might that can always just kill those. Typically, there are artifacts or enchantments that are doing that, and then you can refill up your graveyard quite easily. So I don't think this deck is going to see less play because its best matchup gets nerfed. So of course that's kind of the metagame. Is it going to be as viable as it was? I do believe it does do kind of bad against the Jeskai Oculus decks and Mono Black, which I think are going to be the default number 1 and number 2 decks because I think people are just going to go back like a rotation before Cori-Steel Cutter and see what decks were doing good. And so you have Dimir. You have some version of like Black that's running the demons. You have Dimir They're not going to go bounce anymore. They're just going to go your traditional Dimir, kind of low to the ground, fill back up with Enduring Curiosity or Gix. And you're going to have Jessica Oculus, in my opinion. That's my prediction for the decks that are just going to come out swinging. So, yeah. So I think that the Jessica Oculus, which I'm not even seeing a list here. So Orzhov Bounce definitely is going to need some readjustment. Rakdos Reanimator is another interesting one because it also is a turn 4 deck quite consistently. And you can also go in like Jund Reanimator in that same kind of vein where people are utilizing a few green, like rampish cards. You can even, I think, like Abzan Reanimator is still a thing. There's lots of decks that become a lot more viable with the format slowing down. But there's Oculus. So Oculus still has all its pieces. So nothing gets banned out of Oculus. It was one of the best decks pre Cori-Steel Cutter. Arguably gets a lot better with Omniscience Hate. So now people aren't going to be running as many Rest in Peace and Ghost Vacuums. So Jessica Oculus gets a lot better with that. It's still quite easy to get out of a quick Oculus. It can take over the game. Another deck, too, that becomes interesting is going to be the Monument decks because they do get a few upgrades lately with the Final Fantasy. Actually had another 3-drop with Joshua, and I've tested this and it actually makes Boros Monument a lot more consistent. And I have a build that I'm going to be showcasing with Joshua in Boros Monument probably tomorrow for Tuesday Brews Day that I think is very, very good. And again, we're losing a lot of like Omniscience was absolutely the worst matchup for this because there's no way you could race it. And so if Omniscience out of the way, I think this deck gets a lot better. So the meta should adjust, but all in all, like it's just going to make... I still think the tier 1 decks are going to be tier 1 with possibly pushing in, like I said, the demon decks now becoming kind of the go-to choice, maybe Oculus going in there. But I still think that most of these decks are quite viable in the Nurse. The Nurse like this is a good banning, in my opinion, because it doesn't absolutely destroy any of the decks. And it should do exactly what they want, is to keep those decks in check. I mean, basically the only deck that gets completely banned was the Orzhov Bounce. It wasn't even tier. I guess it was. It had a 5% showing of the Pro Tour. But the rest of them, though, they're just going to adjust and find new ways to attack the meta. And I think the pieces of the decks, the main juicy pieces, are still there. I mean, Cori-Steel Cutter, obviously. That was the focal point of the Izzet decks. But Izzet decks are still viable. They're very viable. And yeah, so it'll be interesting going forward to see if we see any like Celestia mid-range decks or like even, going back to like Golgari mid-range being viable and people attacking the format that way. And there are a lot of cards. The Power Level of Standard is very deep and it's actually some really good like 3, 4, 5 drops that have been completely unplayable because of specifically Monstrous Rage and Cori-Steel Cutter. Because if you can't deal with those two cards, and mid has been so warped around those two cards that there's pointless even looking at a 3-drop in standard that doesn't have immediate effect to either push through Omniscience or deal with the Cori-Steel or the Monstrous Rage type threat. So yeah, going forward, it should be a very, very interesting standard. We're going to attack it hard. I'll go revisit my top 10 list from Final Fantasy. One of the reasons why I haven't been brewing decks around that is because of how hostile it was. It was just such a headache trying to figure out how to beat both Omniscience and Cori-Steel and Monstrous Rage. And with out of the way, that's answered for us now. Now those decks have slowed down a bit or become a little less consistent, and now we can attack the meta. Yeah, going forward. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, kind of a long, kind of ranty video. As I said, we'll be looking at the kind of financial aspects of where I think we'll be checking out the prices here. So go over to my other channel here in a few moments, and we'll get that video uploaded. As always, this has been Kevin with Rogue Deck Builder. Thanks for watching.